It starts with the cold metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut on a quiet suburban street in Crestwood Hills, Illinois, on a crisp October evening, when the oak trees were still holding their leaves, and the neighbors were just sitting down to dinner, and the whole neighborhood smelled like wood smoke, and the particular kind of peace that people pay a very significant premium to live inside of. A black man in a cashmere sweater and tailored slacks stands pressed against the hood of his own car, a charcoal Mercedes parked in his own driveway, his cheek against the cold metal, his arms wrenched behind his back, his wrists already reddening under steel that has been ratcheted a notch past necessary. The red and blue lights of the patrol cruiser pulse against the brick facade of the colonial home behind him, casting wild, lurching shadows across a front porch that still has moving boxes stacked near the door. Neighbors have come outside. Porch lights are clicking on one after another, traveling down Whitmore Lane like a slow wave of illumination. Phones are being raised. Two officers stand over the man, one of them grinning with the particular satisfaction of a predator who has never once been told he went too far. 10 miles away in this corner booth of a diner on Route 9, a police radio squawks a name into the quiet evening air. And the chief of police of Crestwood Hills, a 22-year veteran who has survived 3 administrations and 2 federal inquiries and more political storms than he can accurately count, knocks his coffee across the table, scrambles out of the booth without stopping to wipe it up, sprints to his unmarked SUV, fires the engine, hits the lights and the sirens, and tears out of the parking lot so fast the tires leave black marks on the asphalt. He is not driving like a man responding to a scene. He is driving like a man trying to outrun a verdict that has already been rendered. The question that drives everything that follows is a simple one. What name spoken over a police radio on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday evening could possibly make the most powerful law enforcement officer in the city panic like that? But this story does not start with handcuffs. It starts 30 years earlier, in a city that told a boy named Marcus Ellison exactly where he belonged, and watched with something between indifference and genuine surprise as he went somewhere else entirely. Marcus Ellison is 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, silver at the temples with the kind of deep settled stillness that does not come from comfort or from ease but from the specific experience of surviving things that would have broken a person with less internal architecture. He carries himself the way men carry themselves when they have spent decades being the most prepared person in whatever room they are standing in, not as a performance of confidence, but as a simple fact of how they have chosen to move through a world that did not always choose to accommodate them graciously. He was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, not the romanticized version that appears in magazine profiles and documentary films, but the actual one. The one with the streetlights that went dark by 9 and stayed dark because the repair requests kept getting lost in some municipal filing system that nobody was in any particular hurry to fix. The one where the single branch library closed at 4 in the afternoon because there was no budget for evening staff. The one where the school gymnasium ceiling leaked every winter and the buckets arranged beneath the drips became so familiar that the students stopped noticing them entirely. His mother, Evelyn Ellison, worked double shifts as a hospital dietary aide for 29 years. She never complained about the work, and she never explained it either. She simply did it with the particular dignity of a woman who has decided that the work she does is not a definition of her worth, but simply a thing that needs doing, and she is the one available to do it. Her hands were rough and cracked every winter, the knuckles splitting open at the joints, bleeding sometimes into the wash basin before she wrapped them and went back to the kitchen. And Marcus remembers those hands the way some people remember landmarks, as fixed points of reference, as evidence of something true and permanent in the world. Evelyn had one rule that she communicated not through lecture, but through repetition, through the specific choices she made every single day in front of her son. You do not let them define the ceiling. You find the door they forgot to lock, and you walk through it. Marcus found the door. He became a criminal defense attorney at 33, working 18-hour days in a 4th-floor office downtown with a secretary named Donna who brought him coffee without being asked, and told him on his last day in that office that she was not crying about the distance, She was crying about the principle of the thing. At 38, he crossed to prosecution drawn by the specific logic that the machinery he had spent years defending people against was a machinery that could theoretically be operated differently, and that someone needed to be the person operating it differently, and that it might as well be him. He became a federal prosecutor. He won cases. He won bigger cases. He built a reputation that traveled ahead of him into rooms before he arrived, the kind of reputation that other lawyers mentioned quietly to each other as a warning or as a benchmark depending on which side of the courtroom they were standing on. The state attorney general recruited him personally over dinner at a restaurant in Springfield and laid out the assignment directly. There were police departments across Illinois operating as though accountability was a concept that applied to other people. There were communities bearing the cost of that assumption. Someone needed to go and document the full scope of what was happening and dismantle it from the inside out. The AG had looked at Marcus across the table and said simply, "You are the only person I trust to do this without flinching." Marcus had said he needed to think about it. He thought about it for approximately 4 hours. Then he called the AG back and said yes. But the real reason he said yes, the reason that lives below the professional logic, below the legal mandate, below every carefully constructed argument about institutional accountability, is a man named Harold Boone. Harold Boone was a black detective who had worked the city for 24 years with the kind of integrity that became almost inconvenient in a department that was increasingly comfortable with a different set of operating principles. Marcus had met him at 19 as a summer intern at the public defender's office when Harold was the detective who had taken the time unrequested, unpaid for it, simply because he thought it mattered to walk a terrified 19-year-old through the specific mechanics of how a criminal case actually works, from the street to the cell and every procedural step between. He ate peanut butter crackers at his desk. He laughed at his own jokes before he reached the punchline. He was the first person who told Marcus with complete and uncomplicated certainty that Marcus was going to be something. 24 years into his career, Harold Boone filed a formal misconduct complaint against a pattern of racially discriminatory traffic stops being run out of his own precinct. He documented everything, filed it through proper channels, did exactly what the procedure said he was supposed to do when he observed something wrong. 6 weeks later, he was quietly removed from his position on a technicality buried in a pension eligibility clause that nobody had ever enforced before and nobody enforced again after. His badge number was retired administratively. His pension was stripped. 8 months after that, Harold Boone died of a stroke in a studio apartment on the wrong side of the county line. He was 63 years old. He died alone. Marcus carries Harold's badge number, 4417, written on a small folded piece of paper in his wallet. He has carried it for 11 years. He carried it through every trial, every verdict, every moment when the easier thing would have been to look away, and he has never once taken it out without understanding exactly why he became the man he became, and exactly what that man is for. Marcus signed the papers on 317 Whitmore Lane on a Tuesday morning in September, sitting in the title company's office in his best charcoal suit, paying in cash, and he sat for a long moment afterward, looking at his own signature on the line that said owner before he capped his pen and handed the documents back across the desk. His mother, Evelyn, had lived her entire life on the east side of the county line. In 51 years, she had never lived west of it. Marcus had bought the house in cash without a co-signer, without negotiating the price down, because he did not need to, and he had told no one except the AG's office and his mother had said nothing when he told her, just held the phone for a moment in that particular way she had of receiving significant information, letting it settle into its proper place before she responded, and then she had said, "Good." I always liked a porch. The house itself was a 4-bedroom colonial with dark hardwood floors that caught the afternoon light in long golden panels. High ceilings with original plasterwork and a wraparound porch that was the specific reason Marcus had chosen it over 3 other properties in the neighborhood. The porch mattered. It mattered because it was visible from the street. It mattered because it was the kind of porch a man sat on in the evening, to be simply a man present in his own neighborhood. A neighbor, a resident, a person who belonged there in the most uncomplicated and fundamental sense of the word. He had moved in 3 days earlier. Boxes were still stacked in the second bedroom, but the porch already had a wooden chair, a small side table, and a lamp that he had plugged into the exterior outlet on his first night there, because he wanted the light on, because he wanted the house to look inhabited, because he wanted Whitmore Lane to know from the very first evening that someone lived here now. He had chosen Crestwood Hills deliberately, and not for the oak trees that lined the streets, or for the imported luxury sedans in the curved driveways, or for the particular quality of silence that the neighborhood's property values purchased. He had chosen it because the Crestwood Hills Police Department was the subject of his new assignment, and it was an assignment that had arrived with a file so thick it required 2 separate binders documenting a use-of-force complaint rate that had climbed 47% over 3 years. Traffic stop data with racial disparities that were not merely troubling, but were in Marcus's legal assessment, statistically indefensible in any courtroom in the state, and an internal affairs division that had managed with remarkable consistency to find insufficient evidence for discipline in 98% of all civilian complaints filed against its own officers. And buried at the center of the file, flagged by 3 separate investigators who had each been quietly reassigned before they could finish their work, was a document called the Bowen Crane Audit, an internal review conducted 2 years earlier that had documented with considerable specificity the disappearance of $52,000 from the department's narcotics evidence locker, with a paper trail that pointed clearly and uncomfortably toward senior members of the command staff. Chief Raymond Doyle had filed the audit's findings as inconclusive. He had done this 11 days after the lead investigator on the audit was transferred to a desk position in records management. The audit had not been opened since. Marcus had read every page of it 6 weeks after accepting his appointment. He wanted to observe the department from the ground up before beginning his formal process to see how the city operated when it believed no one with authority was paying attention. He had moved in quietly on a private corporate lease arranged through the AG's office, and he had planned to spend the first 2 weeks simply watching before he made a single official move. He got his answer on day 3. The evening of October 14th was the kind of crisp autumn evening that makes people who live in the Midwest feel briefly powerfully grateful for the specific texture of October air, the kind that carries wood smoke from somewhere nearby, and the distant sound of a football game on somebody's television, and the faint sweetness of leaves that have been damp and are now drying in the last of the afternoon warmth. Marcus stepped onto the porch in his cashmere sweater and tailored slacks. He had been reviewing case files at the dining table for 3 hours, and he needed the air to retrieve a package that had been left at the edge of the property by a delivery driver who had apparently not been willing to brave the porch steps. He walked out, picked up the package, looked for a moment at the street, a golden retriever trotting past on a leash. 2 kids on bikes arguing about something with the passionate intensity that children bring to arguments about things that don't matter at all, and felt for the first time in what felt like months. Like he was simply a man standing on his own porch on a pleasant evening with nothing urgent requiring his attention. Then he turned to go back inside, and the smart lock on the custom mahogany front door blinked at him, a small, insistent red, and did not respond to his code. He tried twice more. The mechanism was jammed, a battery failure in the reset circuit, a thing he had dealt with once before in his apartment downtown. A minor inconvenience that he knew from experience would take approximately 3 minutes to resolve. He set the package down on the porch, reached into his pocket for the small flathead screwdriver he had taken to carrying since his father taught him 30 years ago that most things that appear broken are simply waiting to be gently persuaded back into function, and he crouched by the door to pry the battery casing loose. He was entirely at peace. The evening was still. He was not a prosecutor in that moment, not a case file, not a threat to anyone's career or pension or carefully constructed institutional protection. He was a man fixing his act on his own front porch in the last of the October light. It was one of the rare moments of simple normality that his work had always made difficult and that he had always quietly, stubbornly refused to give up on entirely. He did not notice the curtains moving in the house across the street. Gloria Whitfield had lived on Whitmore Lane for 19 years, which in her own accounting made her something close to an institution, a keeper of the neighborhood's continuity. A person who remembered when the Hendersons had first moved into 317 and could tell you the exact year the Pattersons had repainted their shutters and had strong opinions about the Homeowners Association's current policy on holiday lighting that she had expressed in writing on 3 separate occasions. She was 62, thin, precise, with silver hair maintained in a state of immaculate compression that suggested considerable investment of both time and product. And she wore pressed linen even to check her own mailbox, which she did at the same time every morning, because consistency in her view was next to whatever other virtues she held most dear. She had been out of town when the moving trucks came to 317. Her sister's hip replacement in Tampa, a week-long commitment that had taken her away from Whitmore Lane at the precise moment when the neighborhood's composition was quietly, fundamentally changing. She had returned to find an unfamiliar car in the Henderson driveway, and subsequently an unfamiliar man on the Henderson porch, and she was watching him now through her kitchen window, with the particular alert stillness of a woman who has appointed herself responsible for things that are not technically her responsibility. The fear she felt watching Marcus crouch at the front door with the small tool in his hand was entirely real to her. And this is the specific tragedy of the story. Not a cartoonish villain twirling a mustache, but a woman acting on assumptions so deeply embedded in the architecture of her perception that she could not identify them as assumptions at all. She saw what she had been taught by decades of a specific kind of cultural instruction to see a large black man in dark clothing crouching at the door of a house she believed to be empty, holding what appeared to be a prying tool in a neighborhood where his presence did not register to her as belonging. She did not walk across the street. She did not knock on her own neighbor's door, which would have been the work of 30 seconds and would have resulted in a brief awkward conversation and a story she might have told later with some embarrassment. She did not call the non-emergency line, which exists precisely for situations that require police attention but do not constitute active emergencies. She picked up her phone, dialed 911, and reported a burglary in progress with a trembling urgency that she experienced as civic courage, and that the dispatcher on the other end processed as a credible emergency call requiring immediate response. Patrol Car 22 was finishing the tail end of a traffic stop 3 blocks away when the dispatch call came through, and Officer Brett Kowalski reached forward and turned up the volume on the radio before the dispatcher had even finished speaking the address, because Kowalski had the scanner on an open channel, and he heard these things fast, and he had learned over 9 years on the Crestwood Hills force to move toward anything that sounded like action before someone else got there first. Kowalski was 38, built wide through the chest and shoulders in the way of a man who had once been genuinely athletic and had let the discipline slide while retaining the physical vocabulary of authority that came with the frame, the wide-legged stance, the forward lean, the hand that drifted toward the duty belt, with the practiced ease of long habit. He had 11 citizen complaints in his personnel file, all of them cleared by internal affairs, all of them involving Black or Latino men, and the consistent pattern of their clearance had taught him something specific and dangerous, that the system was a structure built to hold his shape, and that there was no weight he could put on it that would cause it to give way. His nickname in the precinct was the Closer, and he wore it with the kind of pride that reveals more than the person wearing it intends. He was not called the Closer because he solved cases with particular brilliance. He was called the Closer because he closed situations down fast and hard, and with a minimum of procedural friction, and the precinct culture had decided collectively and without much deliberation that this was a virtue worth rewarding. Officer Danny Pruitt, 26 years old and 8 months out of the academy, sat in the passenger seat with his regulation notepad on his knee and watched his training officer respond to the dispatch call, with the particular queasy alertness of a young man who had joined the force with genuine conviction and was learning at an accelerating pace what that conviction was worth inside this specific patrol car on this specific force. Pruitt had joined because his uncle had been a firefighter for 20 years, and his grandfather had served in the Army, and public service had always seemed to him like something worth doing, like a meaningful way to spend the hours of a life. He had 8 months of watching Kowalski fabricate probable cause for traffic stops on vehicles with out-of-state plates, of watching the casual racist commentary delivered in the locker room, in the tone of a man sharing uncontroversial observations about the weather, of watching situations escalate that did not need to escalate while he stood nearby and said nothing, because saying something meant career suicide, and career suicide meant his uncle's face at Thanksgiving and the specific silence of a table that used to be proud of him. He had not yet found the courage to be right at a cost. This evening was going to make that failure irreversible, and he was going to spend the next several years understanding exactly what it had cost. Kowalski turned the cruiser without authorization. He had jumped the dispatch call without being assigned to it. A procedural violation that would appear in the federal investigation report as one of 17 documented irregularities in his conduct during the incident, and cut his siren 2 blocks out to approach, quietly, because he liked arriving before the situation knew he was coming. The cruiser came down Whitmore Lane with its lights off, moving at the particular slow, deliberate pace of a vehicle whose driver is calculating rather than observing. And Marcus, who had just pressed the battery casing back into the slot and heard the lock emit its satisfying preliminary beep, stood and turned to reach for the door handle, and the world behind him became a wall of white light. The spotlight hit him without warning, disorienting and total flooding across the porch and washing out the warm autumn color of everything. The brick, the wood, the box he had set on the porch step, and replacing it with a harsh, flat whiteness that made the world look suddenly like an interrogation. The screech of tires followed immediately, the cruiser hopping the curb at the base of his driveway with the kind of aggressive stop designed to communicate dominance before a single word has been spoken. Marcus's response in the half-second between the light and his first deliberate breath was not panic. It was something older and more practiced, and far more painful than panic. The particular awareness that he had been carrying since he was 14 years old, and a police officer had stopped him on his way home from the library because he was walking too slowly through a neighborhood whose demographic composition the officer had apparently decided required monitoring. The awareness that you can be completely ordinary, reading a book, fixing a lock, standing on your own porch in your own sweater with your own coffee cooling on your own table, and still be perceived by the right person in the right uniform in the right mood as a problem that requires solving. He had never been able to fully put this awareness down. Not after law school, not after his first federal conviction, not after dinner with the Attorney General of Illinois, not after signing the papers on a 4-bedroom colonial with cash. It lived in him at a depth below argument, below achievement, below every credential he had spent his life accumulating. It simply waited quiet and patient and almost impersonally accurate for the moments when it was needed. He set the screwdriver down on the porch railing in a single deliberate motion, making sure it was visible, making sure it read as exactly what it was. A man putting something down transparently on purpose, and turned to face the spotlight. Kowalski came up the walkway with his right hand resting on the butt of his holstered weapon, not drawing it, not yet, but establishing the proximity of it as a conversational opening. And he stopped at the base of the porch steps without introducing himself, without explaining the basis for the stop, without any of the procedural courtesies that exist not merely as bureaucratic formality, but as the specific mechanisms by which a citizen is supposed to understand that what is happening to them is a lawful interaction and not an ambush. He said, "Step away from the door. Hands where I can see them." Marcus raised both hands to chest height, palms open and forward, and said, "Good evening, officers. There's no problem here. I'm just fixing my lock." His voice was calm and resonant and entirely steady. The voice of a man who has spent 30 years in rooms where composure was not optional, and who had learned that the sound of your own voice, controlled and unhurried, was the first line of anything you were going to accomplish. Kowalski's response was a short, contemptuous sound and a second command: "Step down off the porch." Marcus took one slow step down the stairs, continuing to identify himself as he did so. His name, the address, the location of his identification in his back right pocket, offered freely, proactively, in the way that every legal training on de-escalation recommends and every practical understanding of the stakes demanded. Kowalski said, "Yeah, right. Homeowner. The phrase landed the way a diagnosis lands, delivered not as a hypothesis but as a conclusion already reached, and Marcus felt in the space beneath his ribs the particular compression that comes from hearing the oldest sentence in the world spoken aloud again. The sentence that has been spoken to men who look like him in 1,000 different formulations across 100 years of American geography. The sentence that says, "This place is not for you. Your presence here is an irregularity. Your belonging is a claim I do not accept." Inside his jacket, his state credentials pressed against his ribs, the laminated card, the seal of the Attorney General's office. 2 words that would end this encounter before it began. Marcus considered them for exactly the length of time it took to think of Harold Boone Harold, who had filed his complaint through proper channels, Harold who had done everything right. Harold who had died in a studio apartment at 63 with his pension stripped and his name removed from the department roster. And he decided with the cold precision of a man who has been planning this moment without knowing he was planning it for 11 years that the truth needed to finish writing itself on this driveway with these witnesses on these phones before he reached for anything. Kowalski grabbed his left arm with the kind of force that does not ask a question. Marcus stumbled but caught himself and did not retaliate, and did not resist, and kept his hands where they were because he understood with complete and terrible clarity what the alternative looked like, and he had seen it in files, in footage, in the particular weight of a case involving a man who had moved too quickly, or spoken too loudly, or been too present in his own body at the wrong moment. Kowalski shouted, "Stop resisting," the phrase so practiced and so reflexive it had become almost meaningless. A linguistic checkbox, a verbal mechanism for transforming compliance into evidence. And Marcus said loud enough for the neighbors now visibly on their porches to hear clearly, "I am not resisting. I am complying under protest. This is an unlawful stop." Pruitt stood 6 feet away, hand on his own belt face, doing the specific work of a young man trying not to know what he knows. He said nothing. He would spend the next 2 years understanding what that silence cost, and the year after that trying to begin paying it back. They put him against his own car with enough force that his cheekbone hit the roof edge, and the cold metal of the door pressed into his chest, and Kowalski's knee went into the small of his back with the practiced ease of a man for whom this was simply the way things were done, and Whitmore Lane, which had been so beautifully, expensively quiet 15 minutes ago, was now a theater with an audience assembled on every available porch. Phones raised recording the particular spectacle of a cashmere-sweatered man pressed against a charcoal Mercedes in his own driveway with a police officer's knee in his spine. Gloria Whitfield stood at the edge of her property, arms crossed, watching with the expression of a woman who believes she has performed a service and is waiting to be acknowledged for it. Pruitt searched Marcus's pockets with hands that were not quite steady and found the wallet in his back right pocket and opened it under the ambient glow of the cruiser's lights and read the name on the driver's license and the address printed beneath it. And both the name and the address matched the house they were standing in front of, and he said, "Higgins Kowalski. His ID says Marcus Ellison. The address matches." Kowalski did not release the pressure on Marcus's spine. "It's a fake," he said. "Or he stole the wallet. Guys like this don't live in houses like this." Marcus closed his eyes against the cold metal of the car door. The sentence was not a surprise. It was the oldest sentence in the world, and he had heard it in 100 different registers across his entire life. But there was something about hearing it said aloud here at 51 years old, with his mother's cracked hands in his memory and Harold Boone's badge number in his wallet, that landed somewhere beneath argument in the place where a person simply holds the weight of a thing and does not try to explain it away. He opened his eyes. He spoke directly to Pruitt because Pruitt was the one who still had something to lose, the one whose face still registered the sickness of knowing the wrong thing was happening, the one who had not yet made the choice to be complicit. "Officer," he said, "look at my ID again. Run my name through dispatch. You have 3 minutes before this becomes something none of us can walk back." Kowalski laughed, a loud, abrasive sound that bounced off the brick of the house and carried clearly to every porch on the street, and said, 3 minutes. That's rich. And he hauled Marcus's arms behind his back. The sound of handcuffs being deployed is a short, specific mechanical rattle, a sound Marcus had heard in courtrooms and in case recordings and in depositions and in the testimony of clients and witnesses for 3 decades, a sound so familiar it had become almost neutral to him, part of the furniture of his professional life. Unremarkable in the way that the sounds of a familiar environment become unremarkable over time. He had never felt it before. He understood in the moment that the first cuff closed around his left wrist, that there is a categorical difference between knowing a thing and experiencing it, and that this particular thing was not something any amount of professional familiarity had actually prepared him for. The first cuff bit into his wrist, and Kowalski ratcheted it 1 notch past the standard, then another, the steel edge making contact with the bone of his wrist in a way that was immediately and unmistakably deliberate. A small act of cruelty performed with the ease of long practice. The kind of thing done by a man who knows exactly what he is doing and who has never once been required to account for it. Marcus felt the circulation in his left hand begin to diminish almost immediately, a tingling numbness traveling from the steel toward his fingertips. Kowalski leaned in close, his breath warm and unwanted against Marcus's ear, and said very quietly, "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." The second cuff, tighter than the first. Marcus looked out across Whitmore Lane from his position against the car hood, his cheek against cold metal, his arms wrenched behind him, and he counted calmly, deliberately, as if he were counting evidence, the number of phones he could see raised and recording. He counted 7. He thought good. He was aware of the red welts forming on his wrists, of the bruise already beginning to declare itself on his left cheekbone where the car had connected, of the dirt on the cashmere sweater that Evelyn had given him for his birthday 2 years ago, and that he had worn because he was proud of it, because she had saved specifically for it, because he had thought it was the kind of sweater a man wore when he finally lived somewhere worth wearing it. He was not filled with rage in that moment, though the rage was there beneath everything, ancient and structural and entirely undiminished by the composure he was maintaining over it. What he was doing actively, and with the full capacity of a mind that had been trained for 30 years to build cases, was cataloging Kowalski's badge number, Pruitt's badge number, the cruiser number, the precise time, the number of witnesses, the physical evidence of the 2 tight cuffs that would leave marks that could be photographed, documented, and entered into a federal complaint within 24 hours. He was already building. They had not understood because they were not capable of understanding that they were not arresting a man. They were providing testimony. Kowalski hauled him upright. Marcus stood straight, did not hunch, did not perform defeat, did not give the watching neighborhood the image of a broken man, and looked directly at Kowalski with the specific expression of a person who is choosing deliberately and with full awareness of the choice to wait. He said, "Officer, I'm going to give you 1 chance. Run my name through dispatch. Everything that happens after this moment is your choice and you will live with it." Kowalski said, "Get him in the car," and laughed, and the laugh carried down the street and into the memory of every neighbor recording it, and would later be played in federal proceedings as audio evidence of the officer's demeanor during the unlawful arrest. Pruitt pressed the button on his shoulder radio to call it in, his voice careful and professionally neutral in the way of a young man trying to sound like the situation is more routine than he knows it to be. And Marcus stood handcuffed in his own driveway and listened to the machinery of the system beginning formally to turn. Dispatch asked for the suspect's name. Kowalski grabbed his own radio and announced it. Marcus Ellison spelled it out with the contemptuous precision of a man who has made an arrest and wants the record to know he has made it. The silence that followed lasted 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. On a normal call, dispatch would have responded within 2 or 3 seconds. A name check runs in moments. The database returns instantly. This silence meant something, and Marcus, standing in his driveway with his wrists going numb, heard it the way a musician hears a wrong note, immediately, completely, without needing to analyze why. The dispatcher's voice came back, and it had changed. The professional neutrality was still there, but something else was underneath it. A quality of careful measurement of a person choosing their next words with unusual deliberation. Unit 22, please repeat the suspect's name. Kowalski repeated it. His voice touched now with the first hair-thin edge of something he would not yet have been able to identify as unease. What's the holdup? Another pause longer than the first. And then Unit 22, hold your position. Do not transport. The chief is getting on the radio. Kowalski stared at his handset. He exchanged a look with Pruitt that contained on Kowalski's side genuine confusion, and on Pruitt's side the specific expression of a young man who has begun to understand what he has been made a part of. Marcus, still standing in his driveway, allowed himself the smallest possible movement. Not a smile exactly, more a settling, a release of something held the quiet recognition of a man who set something in motion 3 days ago and is now watching it arrive. He thought of Harold. He thought of Evelyn. He thought of the Bowen Crane audit sitting in 2 binders on his dining room table 40 feet from where he was currently standing in handcuffs on his own property, and he breathed slowly and waited. They left him standing by the cruiser while they waited, Kowalski leaning against the patrol car with his arms crossed, trying to recover the posture of a man in control of his situation. Pruitt looking at his phone with the intensity of a man who is not actually looking at his phone, and the red and blue lights continued their mechanical pulse across the brick of the house and the oak leaves overhead and the faces of the neighbors who had now been standing on their porches long enough to understand that this was not a routine stop and that something important was happening on Whitmore Lane tonight. Marcus stood straight and still and used the silence to do what he had done in 100 courtrooms and 1,000 case reviews he cataloged. Badge numbers memorized. Cruiser number memorized. Precise time of cuffing noted against his sense of elapsed time. Neighbors' recording counted and approximate positions noted. The screwdriver still visible on the porch railing where he had deliberately set it. The package still on the porch step. The smart lock's red light, which had now reset to its default standby state and would, when investigated, show no evidence of forced entry. Because there had been no forced entry, because the man pressing against the hood of the parked car was the man who owned the lock. He thought about Harold Boone, not the professional memory, but the personal one, the specific texture of the man, the way Harold ate peanut butter crackers at his desk with an air of complete contentment, the way he laughed at the setup of his own joke before delivering the punchline, the way he had looked at Marcus on the last day. Marcus saw him 6 months before Harold's complaint was filed and said, "Go fix it from the inside." Lord knows someone has to. Harold had never seen Marcus become what he became. He had died 7 months before Marcus's first major conviction against a corrupt command structure alone in an apartment on the wrong side of a county line he had spent his career trying to make irrelevant. Marcus had carried that timing like a wound that would not close all the way. He thought about Evelyn. Her hands, the specific roughness of them, the way she had said nothing for a moment when he told her about the house and then said simply with the certainty of a woman who has been right about her son for 51 years. Good. I always liked a Porch. Across the street, Gloria Whitfield had not moved. She was still standing at the edge of her property, arms crossed with the expression of a woman who expected to be thanked and was beginning to sense in the quality of the silence and the length of the wait that the thanking was not coming. Marcus looked at her. She did not look away. In her eyes he saw something that was not quite malice and not quite guilt. It was certainty, the specific, settled certainty of a person who has never once been wrong about this kind of thing, who has never once been confronted with the evidence that the kind of thing she was always right about was not a thing at all, but a story she had been telling herself in the dark for 62 years. That was about to change. He waited. Gloria Whitfield saw the chief's SUV turn the corner. She did not know yet that it was the chief. Only that it was an unmarked vehicle moving with the urgency of someone important. And she drew herself up with the particular straightening of a woman who is about to receive acknowledgement for something she believes she did well. And she walked across the street and up the driveway of 317 Whitmore Lane with the purpose of a person arriving to claim a prize. She stopped near Kowalski and announced in a voice pitched to carry, "I'm the one who called. I saw him picking the lock. I knew he didn't belong here. Good work." She looked at Marcus with the expression of a woman whose assessment of a situation has been validated by authority, and she did not notice for a moment that the authority present was not looking at her the way she had anticipated. Marcus turned and looked at her. Just looked for a moment with the full, quiet, level attention of a man who has spent 30 years assessing people in high-stakes situations and does not need to perform anything to make his assessment understood. He said his name. He told her when he had purchased the house and when he had moved in, and that the moving was handled privately due to the nature of his employment with the state of Illinois. He watched her face move through several rapid recalculations that she was not quite equipped to complete. Then he asked her one question quietly, precisely, with the measured care of a man who has spent a career asking the question that the moment actually requires, not the one that is easy to answer. He asked, "Did you call 911 because I had a small screwdriver in my hand, or because of what I look like standing in this neighborhood?" Gloria opened her mouth and closed it. The question had no safe harbor. She had known in the part of herself she did not spend much time in, that she had not been able to look at Marcus and see a neighbor, and she had built an entire emergency response on top of that specific inability. And now she was standing in front of the man she had sicked that response on, and he was looking at her. Not with anger, anger would have been easier, but with the patient, precise attention of someone who is allowing you the full experience of understanding what you have done. He told her she would be subpoenaed. He told her the 911 audio would be obtained. He told her that initiating a false police report that resulted in the physical injury of another person carries civil exposure that she would be wise to discuss with an attorney before the week was out. He said these things in the tone of a man conveying accurate information, not threats. And that tone was somehow more difficult to withstand than anything louder would have been. Gloria turned and walked back to her house with the speed of a woman who has understood something she cannot unhear and cannot unknow, and her door closed and her curtains drew, and she did not emerge again that evening. Chief Raymond Doyle was in the corner booth of Paulie's Diner on Route 9 when the radio call came through, and he was doing what he did most evenings. When the accumulated pressure of running a department under state investigation became too heavy to carry. Inside the office, he was sitting with a black coffee and a week-old newspaper in a diner that did not have Wi-Fi worth mentioning, letting the low ambient noise of other people's ordinary lives provide a buffer between himself and the inbox that was trying to end his career. He was 58 years old and had been a cop since he was 26, the son of a cop and the grandson of a cop in the way that some men are sons and grandsons of particular professions without having precisely chosen them. And he had always understood himself to be a good man, doing a necessary job, which is the self-understanding of a man who has not yet been forced to examine the specific mechanisms by which he has allowed the job to become something other than good. The state AG's office had been circling Crestwood Hills for 6 months. The warnings from the department's legal counsel had been accumulating, with the patient consistency of water finding its level. He had been told explicitly in a meeting with the governor's deputy that had lasted 42 minutes and from which he had emerged sweating through his shirt collar that his department was one high-profile mistake away from a federal consent decree, and that a federal consent decree meant command staff terminated pensions. Stripped and the department restructured from the outside by people who had not spent 22 years building it. He had been waking up at 3 in the morning with chest pain. His doctor said stress. Doyle privately suspected something more permanent and had been avoiding finding out. The radio on his belt squawked and he reached for his coffee and ignored it, because standard dispatch traffic during dinner was the watch commander's business, and then the address came through 317. Whitmore Lane, and his hand stopped. He knew that address. The mayor had called him personally 4 days ago. Corporate lease AG's office, highly sensitive. AVIP placement, do not disturb, do not run any proactive calls in that vicinity. Handle it with the same care you would handle a live wire. He set the coffee down with the deliberate care of a man whose hands are beginning to shake. Kowalski's voice came through the radio with the casual confidence of a man who has made an arrest and is filing the paperwork in his head. Suspect is claiming the name Marcus Ellison. The diner continued around Chief Raymond Dossier's style of family at the table by the window. Someone's kid drawing on a paper placemat. The waitress carrying a plate of pie toward the counter. The particular warm yellow light of a place that had been feeding the same families for 30 years. And none of it registered because in the space of 4 syllables, the entire structure of the next several years of Doyle's life had just reorganized itself around a catastrophe. Marcus Ellison. The name had been in every internal memo, every confidential briefing, every late-night warning from the department's own attorney for the past 3 months. The man who had taken apart the Peoria PD's command structure in 2019. The man who had walked into Rockford in 2021 and walked out 18 months later, with the union leadership indicted and the chief resigning in lieu of prosecution. The man that the AG's own office described in a briefing document Doyle had read 4 times in his office with the door closed, as the person who goes through the floorboards who already has everything before he walks in, who does not need your cooperation because he built his case before he introduced himself. Doyle did not key his radio immediately. He stared at the wall of the diner for 4 full seconds, the way a man stares at something when his brain is refusing to process what his eyes are telling him, and the waitress came by to offer a refill, and he looked at her as though she had spoken to him in a language he did not know. Then he moved, threw cash on the table without counting. It did not stop for his coat, did not stop for anything, and he was through the door and across the parking lot, and in his SUV, before the cold air had fully hit him. And he was on the radio, before he was out of the parking lot, the tires smoking as he pulled into the street. His voice on the radio was not the voice of a man in command. It was the voice of a man who has understood with sudden and total clarity the full scope of what has already happened and is operating entirely in damage control mode at a point where there may be insufficient damage left to control. Unit 22. This is Chief Doyle. Hold your position. Do not transport. Do not speak to the suspect. If you have a hand on him, take it off. Right. Now, I am 5 minutes out and I need you to not do one more thing until I am standing in front of you. Do you hear me? Kowalski and Pruitt stood beside the cruiser on Whitmore Lane and heard the chief's voice come through the radio with a quality neither of them had heard from him before. Not authority exactly, but something rawer and more urgent than authority. Something adjacent to fear, and they exchanged a look in which Pruitt saw the first crack in Kowalski's certainty and felt it not as relief, but as the specific dread of a man who was beginning to understand the scope of what he participated in. Marcus heard the radio call. He was still standing in his driveway, handcuffed, his wrists going progressively more numb, the marks of the steel already deepening on his skin, and he listened to the chief's voice and thought, there it is. The machinery had reached the people who understood what it meant. He breathed. He waited. He thought of Harold Boone and the piece of paper in his wallet, and the 11 years it had taken to arrive at this specific driveway on this specific night, and he found that the waiting was not difficult, because he had been in some sense waiting for this his entire life. Doyle's SUV came around the corner of Whitmore Lane at a speed that was clearly not the speed of a responding officer. It was the speed of a man running from something and toward something simultaneously, and it did not slow gracefully, but lurched to a stop half on the grass at the base of the driveway, the driver's door swinging open before the vehicle had fully settled, and Chief Raymond Doyle half fell out of the driver's seat and sprinted up the driveway. He was breathless. His tie was crooked. His face had the mottled crimson of a man who has had a cardiovascular event and managed to convert it at the last moment into a sprint. He ignored Kowalski completely. He ignored Pruitt completely. He stopped directly in front of Marcus Ellison and looked at him. Looked at the handcuffs, at the red welts marking both wrists, at the bruise forming on the left cheekbone, at the cashmere sweater with its streak of dirt from the Mercedes hood. And he closed his eyes for a long moment and let out a breath that had several years of specific decisions inside it. When he opened them, his voice was barely above a whisper. Mr. Ellison, sir, I am so deeply, profoundly sorry. Marcus looked at him as with the level patience of a man who has been standing in his own driveway in handcuffs for 22 minutes and is not yet finished being patient. He said, Chief, I believe you have a key." Doyle reached for the key on his duty belt with hands that were not steady. It took him 3 attempts to seat the key in the mechanism, the metal clicking against the cuff housing twice before finding the slot. And when the steel released, the sound of it was different from the sound of it going on, quieter and less mechanical. A small and insufficient sound for what it was supposed to represent. Marcus brought his arms forward slowly, the circulation returning to his hands in a way that was not comfortable. A deep, stinging rush, pins and needles traveling from the steel lines on his wrists outward to his fingertips, and he rubbed them methodically, taking his time looking at what the cuffs had left on his skin. The documentation already forming itself in his mind as a clear and detailed physical record. He turned and faced the 3 officers in his driveway. He told Kowalski and Pruitt to get off his property. He said it without heat or performance, the way a man asks a thing he knows will be done, and they went Kowalski without looking back. His swagger entirely absent, something almost shrunken in his posture now. Pruitt glancing once at Marcus as he turned the glance of a young man who is not yet ready to articulate what he knows and not yet capable of not knowing it. Marcus looked at Doyle. He said, "Not you." He gestured toward the front door where the smart lock now glowed its steady, welcoming green. "You and I are going to step inside. We have a great deal to discuss." The interior of 317 Whitmore Lane was exactly as Marcus had established it over 3 days of careful, purposeful habitation. Dark hardwood floors, clean white walls. 2 abstract paintings he had chosen because they were restful to look at after long hours with dense documents and the dining table covered in the organized evidence of a man at work. 2 binders, a legal pad, dense with handwriting. A laptop, 3 colored folders arranged by subject. Doyle looked at the table with the particular expression of a man who has just confirmed something he was hoping was not true. Marcus poured himself a glass of sparkling water at the wet bar slowly with the deliberate composure of a man who is allowing the silence to do preliminary work, and he did not offer Doyle anything, and he did not ask him to sit. Doyle began to speak the prepared narrative of a man who has been composing his apology in the car and has arrived ready to deploy it. The assurance that Kowalski would be suspended without pay by morning, that Pruitt would face severe disciplinary review, that Doyle himself would personally oversee the remediation, that this was an isolated failure of individual judgment and not. "Stop talking, Chief," Marcus said, not unkindly, simply as a fact. Doyle stopped. Marcus walked to the dining table and rested both hands on it and looked at Doyle across it, and the bruise on his cheekbone and the marks on his wrists and the streak of dirt on the cashmere sweater were visible in the light of the chandelier, and none of it needed to be commented on, because all of it was simply and permanently there. He said, "Do you think I care about Brett Kowalski?" He gave Doyle the numbers, the 47% increase in use of force complaints over 3 years. The traffic stop disparities that would not survive contact with a federal courtroom. The Internal Affairs Division with a 98% no-discipline rate on civilian complaints filed against its own officers. He did not read these from notes. He had memorized them because he had been memorizing this department's pathologies for 3 months, and because a number memorized is a number that lands differently than a number read. "Kowalski is not an anomaly, Raymond," he said, using the first name deliberately, the way a prosecutor uses a first name when he wants the person across from him to understand that formality has been suspended, and what remains is just 2 men and the truth. He is the pattern. He is what this department has produced and protected and rewarded for 9 years. He felt entirely comfortable assaulting a compliant man on his own property, because he knew with absolute certainty, built over 9 years of unchallenged conduct, that you would not punish him. Because you never have. Because the 15 other men who share his file have never been punished either. He is your department, Raymond. He is what you built. Doyle's silence was its own kind of testimony. Marcus named the Bowen Crane audit. He said it quietly as a statement of fact, and he watched Doyle's face receive the name the way a body receives a blow, not dramatically, but genuinely the specific physical response of a person who has been hit somewhere that was not adequately protected. He described its findings. Captain Dale Mercer and a second senior officer, $52,000 missing from the narcotics evidence locker, a paper trail with the kind of specificity that made inconclusive and extraordinary characterization for anyone who had actually read the document. "I don't knock on the front door," Marcus said. "I come through the floorboards. I had the Bowen Crane audit 6 weeks after my appointment. I was going to use it to force your resignation in 3 months. You had 3 months of relative normalcy left, Raymond. Tonight your officer chose to spend them for you." Marcus walked slowly around the edge of the dining table while he spoke, not pacing, but moving with the deliberate purpose of a man who is comfortable taking up the full space available to him in a room where he is the authority, and he laid the demands out one at a time with the precision of a man who has prepared them carefully and intends to be understood perfectly. Kowalski terminated tomorrow morning, not suspended pending review, not quietly transitioned, not administratively separated with language designed to soften the record, terminated with a formal finding of cause, and Marcus would personally file criminal battery charges with the district attorney's office before noon. Doyle would not shield him. Doyle would not intercede with the union on his behalf. Doyle would sign the termination papers and let the process work exactly the way the process was supposed to work. The Civilian Oversight Board, the one the mayor had been requesting for 2 years, and the police union had successfully blocked through 3 consecutive contract negotiations, implemented immediately with full subpoena power over internal affairs, staffed by an independent board with no departmental appointments. Doyle's first protest was that the union would strike. Marcus said, "You are worried about the morale of men who slam innocent homeowners against cars. Let me tell you about morale." And he did not in abstract terms, but in the specific human terms of Harold Boone, 24 years on the force, filed his complaint through proper channels, removed on a technicality 6 weeks later, died 63 years old and alone with his pension stripped and his badge number retired by the same institution he had spent his career trying to make worthy of his service. Harold Boone had more integrity than anyone currently drawing a paycheck in your department. He followed every rule. He did everything right. And your department, your culture. Raymond, the one you cultivated and protected, destroyed him for it. That is what I am here to correct. Doyle looked at the table. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had reached the point where the carrying and the putting down had become equally impossible. Marcus made the terms of non-compliance explicit and clear if the termination papers were not signed and delivered by 9 in the morning. And if any breach of the agreement occurred, he would release the Bowen Crane audit in its unredacted entirety to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and hold a press conference on his front lawn, where the body cam footage, the 911 audio, the audit and the traffic stop disparities would be made simultaneously available to every Chicago market network and every state and federal law enforcement entity with jurisdiction over municipal police misconduct in Illinois. Doyle said, "You're dismantling my department." Marcus said, "I am performing a necessary amputation to save the patient. You built something that operates on impunity, on the assumption that the badge makes the rules and the institution protects the badge. Tonight you found out what happens when that assumption collides with someone who has the power and the authority and the documented evidence to fight back. Most people Brett Kowalski has slammed against a car have not had that. Harold Boone did not have that. I do, and I intend to use it for everyone who didn't." He walked to the front door and opened it. The cold night air moved through the foyer. The street was quieter now, the neighbors mostly gone back inside. The phones put down the immediate spectacle, resolved into something that would be discussed for weeks. The patrol cruiser was gone. Doyle stopped in the threshold. He turned back once, and what was in his face in that moment was not quite guilt. Guilt implies surprise, but something more complicated and more defeated. The expression of a man who has known for a long time that his accounting was coming, and has simply run out of postponements. "I thought I was a good cop," he said. It was barely above a whisper. "Your job was to protect the public," Marcus said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was completely without compromise. You forgot the difference between that and protecting your people. Good night, Chief. He closed the door. The smart lock clicked into place and glowed its steady green. The squad room of the Crestwood Hills Police Department at 6:15 in the morning had the specific atmosphere of a place where something bad has happened, and the people inside know it, but have not yet agreed on how to talk about it. The fluorescent lights buzzing at their standard frequency, the stale coffee at its standard temperature, and 4 men in the glass-walled office of Chief Raymond Doyle, who were each experiencing the same catastrophe from slightly different angles. Doyle had explained the ultimatum. He had not softened it or reframed it because there was no softening or reframing available. It was what it was, and what it was a man with the full authority of the State Attorney General's office documented physical evidence of an unlawful arrest and assault, a buried audit with enough criminal exposure to end multiple careers, and 9 in the morning as a deadline. Frank Sutter, the union president, 55, heavy-set, red-faced in the specific way of a man who has spent his career confusing volume for authority, said the union would walk. He said Ellison was bluffing. He said a bruised wrist and a hurt ego were not sufficient grounds to dismantle 22 years of institutional structure, and that any county judge in the state would throw out the civil suit before it reached discovery. His voice had the practiced confidence of a man who had won this particular argument before in this particular office with this particular chief, Captain Dale Mercer, 52, who had been leaning against the filing cabinet since Doyle began speaking, and who had gone progressively more still as the specifics of what was on the dining table in 317 Whitmore Lane became clear. Said nothing at all, which was itself a kind of statement. Kowalski was the one who moved things from bad to catastrophic, which was in retrospect entirely predictable to anyone who had studied his file. He said he was not going to be anyone's sacrificial lamb, and he said it with the dark-cornered energy of a man who has decided that if he is going down, he is going down swinging, regardless of who gets hit in the process. Then he told them about the memory card. 2 years ago, Squad Car 12. Doyle and Mercer discussing the alteration of evidence logs. A conversation they believed was private in a vehicle they believed was not recording, and the dashcam audio had been running, and Kowalski had been the one to check the car back into the motor pool, and he had pulled the card, and he had kept it in a safe deposit box ever since, as an insurance policy, because 9 years on the force had taught him that insurance policies were more useful than conduct reports. He delivered this information with the specific satisfaction of a cornered man who has just revealed that the trap has walls on all sides and not just the one his captors are pushing from. Then he walked out and slammed the door hard enough that the glass rattled in its frame. Sutter stared at the wall for a moment. Mercer had pressed himself back against the filing cabinet as though the additional 18 inches of distance from the center of the room would provide some form of protection. Doyle looked at his hands on the desk, the hands that had signed the Bowen Crane audit, as inconclusive, the hands that had shaken Mercer's hand the week after in a quiet moment of shared relief, the hands that had built this department's reputation and its culture and its particular arrangement of loyalties and protections over 22 years. He picked up the phone and called the mayor's office. He told Sutter to get his attorney on the lead immediately. He began quietly and without drama to dismantle what he had spent his career building because it was the only thing left available to him to do. Marcus was in the breakfast nook of 317 Whitmore Lane at 8:45 in the morning, wearing a precisely pressed navy suit and reading through a stack of legal documents with an Earl Grey tea cooling beside his left hand, and the local news streaming on his tablet in the background. And his phone generated a Google alert for his own name at 8:52. Which was not unusual. He tracked his own name for professional reasons, but the source made him set down his pen. The Crestwood Daily Tribune's breaking news blog. The headline, anonymous police source claims incoming state prosecutor used political clout to avoid arrest, threatens good officers with career retaliation. He read the article with the complete equanimity of a man who had spent 3 months reviewing Brett Kowalski's disciplinary file and personnel history and psychological profile, and knew exactly the kind of man he was looking at. Narcissists do not accept defeat. They reframe it. They find a journalist who asks limited questions, they provide a narrative that inverts the events, and they push it into the public record before the accurate account can establish itself. Kowalski had done this with the practiced speed of someone who understood that the first story told is the hardest to correct, which meant he had done this kind of thing before, and that the version of events where Kowalski was the professional and Marcus was the aggressor was not a spontaneous fabrication, but a reflex. Marcus set the phone down and took a slow sip of tea. Then he picked up his phone and made 2 calls, one to his contact at the AG's office and one to a reporter at the Chicago Tribune he had worked with on 2 previous cases. A woman who asked the right questions in the right order and had a record of getting the story accurate on the first publication rather than the correction. He spoke to each of them for less than 5 minutes. He was not in a hurry. The machinery he needed was already assembled and running. Doyle arrived at the door of 317 Whitmore Lane at 8:58 in the morning with a manila folder in his right hand and the expression of a man who has spent the night performing the specific calculus of a person who has run out of options and is now simply accounting for what the options cost. He had the termination papers signed, dated effective immediately. He had the oversight board agreement signed by him, and with considerable reluctance extracted from him by the mayor's office over a 2-hour phone call that had taken place between 2 and 4 in the morning, signed by Frank Sutter as well. He had met the demands. He had done it while Kowalski was holding a recording of him committing a felony over his head. He had done it anyway, because the alternative was worse, but he had done it, and he needed Marcus to understand that it had cost something real. Marcus opened the door before Doyle could knock. He looked at the folder. He did not take it. Instead, he held up his tablet and turned it so Doyle could read the headline. He watched Doyle read it. He watched the color that remained in Doyle's face withdraw from it in stages like light leaving a room window by window. "I didn't authorize that," Doyle said. Kowalski went rogue. The agreement was compliance and silence," Marcus said. "Both conditions. Your officer broke the silence before the ink on those papers was dry. That voids the arrangement." Doyle's hands were shaking. He described the morning Kowalski's revelation, the blackmail, the 2-hour conversation with the mayor's office, the cost of getting Sutter to sign. "I fell on my sword for you," he said. "I signed it while a man was holding a federal crime over my head. I did it anyway." "You did it," Marcus said, "because at 8:58 in the morning, on the day of a 9 o'clock deadline, you had no other viable choice. I understand what it cost. It does not change what Kowalski did at 8:52. Doyle said, "What are you going to do?" Marcus said, "What I came to this city to do." He closed the door quietly, and the lock clicked green, and Chief Raymond Doyle stood on the porch of the house he had failed to protect its owner from, and understood that the accounting he had been running from for 22 years was no longer something he could outpace. By 11:30, Whitmore Lane had become something it had never been in 19 years of Gloria Whitfield's tenure as neighborhood watch captain. A news event. The trucks came in from 3 directions, satellite dishes extending skyward, cables running across the manicured grass, producers in dark coats talking into earpieces while camera operators found angles on a front porch that had 4 days ago been just a porch. State troopers established a perimeter at the property line. The neighbors who had been on their porches the night before were on them again, and this time they understood better what they were watching. Gloria Whitfield's curtains were half drawn. She was there behind them, watching, and Marcus knew she was watching, and he did not look at her window as he walked to the podium because she was not the audience he was addressing. At 12:05, he stepped up to the microphones in his navy suit, immaculate without a wrinkle from the 12 hours since he had put it on, and the cameras flashed in a wave, and the assembled reporters went quiet, with the particular attention that a crowd gives to a person they understand is about to say something that will matter. He began, "3 days ago, I moved into this house on Whitmore Lane to begin my work as Special Prosecutor for the State Attorney General's office. Last night, while I was on my front porch fixing a broken lock, I was racially profiled by 2 officers of the Crestwood Hills Police Department. I was falsely accused of burglary. I was physically assaulted, pressed against my own vehicle, and placed in handcuffs that were ratcheted past standard to ensure they caused injury. I was told by a 9-year veteran of this department, while my wrists were in steel, that guys like me don't live in houses like mine. The murmur that moved through the press corps was brief and immediate, and then gone, replaced by the specific, concentrated silence of people who understand they are listening to something important. "This press conference is not about me," he continued, and his voice carried across the lawn and down Whitmore Lane without effort, the voice of a man who has spent 30 years making sure that what he says reaches the back of every room he stands in. "What happened to me last night is a symptom. The underlying disease has been operating in this department for years, and it has operated in the dark because darkness is the condition under which it survives." He nodded to the technician standing at the monitor. The body cam footage played Kowalski's approach, the commands without explanation, the hands on Marcus, the face against the car, the sound of the cuffs going on. The 911 audio played simultaneously, Gloria Whitfield's voice, clear and precise and unmistakably certain, describing a burglary that was not a burglary, a threat that was not a threat, a man. She had decided to call a criminal without once considering that she might simply be wrong about who he was. The reporters were not murmuring. They were writing. He held up the Tribune printout and named it for what it was: a targeted, deliberately false account fed to a credulous publication by a man facing criminal charges who hoped to establish a competing narrative before the accurate one became impossible to contest. He said this without anger, as a factual characterization, and moved on. He held up the Bowen Crane audit, the bound copy, the full unredacted document, and he named it, named the amounts, named the individuals implicated, named the finding of the lead investigator before that investigator was reassigned, and named the characterization of inconclusive for what it was. The cameras moved to capture the document. He let them. He announced federal civil rights charges against Brett Kowalski filed personally with the district attorney, effective immediately. The Bowen Crane audit transferred in full to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and an emergency petition filed that morning with the state Supreme Court to place the Crestwood Hills Police Department under immediate federal oversight, pending a full structural review. Not a review of individual officers, but of the command culture, the accountability mechanisms, and the institutional arrangements that had allowed this pattern to operate unchallenged for years. He concluded, no one is above the law, especially not those who carry a badge to enforce it, least of all them. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Chief Raymond Doyle and Captain Dale Mercer were walked out of the Crestwood Hills Police Department through the front entrance by federal agents in handcuffs in front of a department they had commanded between them for 31 years. Doyle did not resist and did not speak. He walked with his head slightly down and his hands behind him, and the particular posture of a man who is not performing anything anymore. Not authority, not dignity, not the carefully maintained public face of a chief who has everything under control. Just a man walking to a car, putting one foot in front of the other, carrying the full accumulated weight of every small choice that had led to this specific parking lot on this specific afternoon. At 4 o'clock, Brett Kowalski was arrested at his home on the west side of the city. He answered the door in a gray t-shirt and jeans, and tried briefly to speak, to explain, to contextualize, to deploy the version of events he had fed to the Tribune reporter 12 hours earlier, and the federal agent at his door was not interested in any of it. When the handcuffs went on, Kowalski looked down at them on his wrists, and something moved across his face that was not quite recognition and not quite grief. Something that had no name except the specific feeling of a man who has spent 9 years performing impunity and has reached the moment when the performance ends. His neighbor across the street had come out to get her mail, and she stopped and watched from the end of her driveway, and Kowalski could not look at her, and the agent guided him to the vehicle, and the door closed. Danny Pruitt was not arrested. He had cooperated immediately and completely. His testimony was clean and detailed and damning, and it had cost him every friendship in the precinct, and he had paid that cost without visible complaint, which was the first genuinely courageous thing he had done since putting on the uniform. He was suspended, mandated for extensive training, and required to appear before the federal oversight panel to give his account in full. He gave it in full. It was the first time in 8 months he had said out loud and on the record what he had known from the beginning. Gloria Whitfield received a civil summons on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks after the press conference delivered by a process server she had initially assumed was a delivery driver. She opened the envelope on her own porch and read the return address, Office of the Illinois Attorney General, and stood for a long moment looking at the house across the street where the smart lock on the mahogany door glowed its steady green in the afternoon light. Her attorney told her the case would likely settle. It settled in February for $90,000 drawn from her savings and a home equity loan taken against a house she had lived in for 19 years. She listed the property in April. She told the realtor she wanted to be closer to family. There was no family in particular she was moving toward. She simply could not stand the sight of that green light anymore, steady every evening across the street, unbothered exactly as its owner had always been. 3 weeks after the press conference, a letter arrived at the offices of the Special Prosecutor for the State Attorney General of Illinois addressed to Marcus Ellison, handwritten on 2 sheets of plain paper in the careful, upright script of a man who has thought about every word before committing it. Danny Pruitt did not make excuses. He did not offer mitigating circumstances or contextual explanations or the kind of self-serving framing that people deploy when they want to apologize for something without fully accepting the weight of it. He wrote a precise accounting specific moments, in order each one a moment in which he had known the right thing and done the wrong thing, or known the wrong thing and said nothing about it, which is its own kind of doing. He listed them without embellishment. At the end of the second page he wrote one sentence. I don't know if this letter means anything to you, but I need you to know that I understand exactly what I did and what I didn't do, and I intend to spend whatever time it takes making sure I never stand that still again. Marcus read the letter at the kitchen table over his morning coffee, read it twice, then folded it with the same careful alignment he gave to evidence exhibits, and placed it in his wallet in the same worn leather pocket where the folded piece of paper with Harold Boone's badge number, 4417, had lived for 11 years. He did not write back. 8 months later, when Danny Pruitt submitted his application to work as a community liaison with Crestwood Hills' newly formed Independent Civilian Oversight Board, Marcus did not oppose the appointment. He did not advocate for it either. He simply did not stand in its way, which was for the person who could have ended it with a single word, its own kind of statement. 6 months after the evening when the handcuffs clicked shut in his own driveway on a warm April evening, when the oak trees on Whitmore Lane were just beginning to show the first soft green of new leaves, and the air smelled like cut grass, and the particular sweetness of early spring in the Midwest, Marcus Ellison sat on the porch of 317 Whitmore Lane in a wooden chair he had placed there on his first night in the house, and he was not alone. Evelyn Ellison, 74 years old, sat in the second wooden chair he had since added. He had added it specifically for this. For the evening when she would finally come to visit, which he had promised her would happen once things were settled enough that the house felt like a home and not an outpost. Her hands were in her lap, rough at the knuckles, as they had always been, the skin of them carrying 30 years of work the way old wood carries grain. Not as damage exactly, but as the record of what it has borne and survived and been made stronger by. She was watching the oak trees with the expression she had always had when she was paying full attention to something beautiful without needing to say so. For a while, neither of them spoke. The evening settled around them, a dog somewhere further down the street, a car slowing at the corner, the distant sound of kids on bikes, and it was the most ordinary sound in the world, and it was exactly right. Evelyn said, "You picked a good porch." Marcus said, "I did." She was quiet for a moment, turning her tea mug slowly in her hands. Then she said Harold would have liked it. She had known Harold from the early years the way that certain people know each other's people without ever quite meeting through Marcus, through the occasional phone call, through the particular knowledge that sometimes passes between a mother and the people who have shaped her child. Harold had told Evelyn once in a brief conversation Marcus had not been present for and had only heard about years later that her son was going to change something. Evelyn had said, "I know. I'm just waiting for him to believe it." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and took out his wallet. The old wallet worn at the corners, soft with years of use, and he opened it to the folded piece of paper in the back slot. And he looked at Harold's badge number, 4417, in blue ink that had faded slightly at the edges over 11 years of being carried from room to room and city to city and verdict to verdict. He looked at it for a moment. He thought about what Harold had told him. Go fix it from the inside. Lord knows someone has to, and he thought about what it had taken to do that, and what it had cost, and what it had produced, and how none of it had been straightforward or clean, or the way he had imagined it would feel when he had first folded that piece of paper and put it in his wallet. He closed the wallet and put it back. Down the street, a new face was walking a dog. A woman he had seen a few times. The one who had knocked on his door last month to introduce herself and ask if he'd be willing to speak at the next HOA meeting about community safety in a neighborhood that was, she said, beginning to understand that safety meant something more than keeping certain people out. He had said yes. They had scheduled it for the following Tuesday. The smart lock on the mahogany door glowed its steady green into the April evening. The same green it had glowed on the night he closed the door in Doyle's face, the same green it had glowed every night since, the same quiet, reliable color of a thing that is working the way it is supposed to work. Evelyn reached over and put her rough, cracked, strong hand briefly on his arm, and she didn't say anything, because she had never needed to say much, and neither did he, and the porch light was on, and the tea was warm, and the street was quiet, and after everything, it was enough. There is a specific kind of courage that the world does not celebrate the way it celebrates the louder kinds. Not the courage of the raised voice or the clenched fist or the dramatic confrontation, but the courage of a man who knows exactly what he is holding and chooses deliberately to wait. Marcus Ellison could have ended what happened on that driveway in 10 seconds. 2 words, a laminated card, and Brett Kowalski would have been stammering apologies before the cuffs had time to leave a mark. He chose not to. Not because he was being clever, and not because he was trying to prove something, but because he had spent 30 years watching what happened to the people who didn't have 2 words to reach for, who had nothing but their composure and their voice, and the cold, indifferent weight of steel on their wrists. Harold Boone had no 2 words. Marcus let it happen to him so that it could be documented, witnessed, and used not for himself, but for everyone who comes after, everyone who stands on their own porch in their own neighborhood and gets told in one form or another that they do not belong. Most of us will never carry a prosecutor's badge, but we carry something, a phone, a vote, a voice, a willingness to not look away when someone is being diminished in front of us. A willingness to write the letter that Pruitt wrote, even when we are not sure it will be received. The question is never whether we have something to offer. The question is whether we offer it only when it costs us nothing, or whether we offer it when the cost is real and the outcome is uncertain, and the easier choice is to stand still and say nothing. That choice made in the moment when silence would have been so much simpler is the only kind of justice that actually lasts. If this story stayed with you, if you recognized something in Marcus's patience, or in Evelyn's certainty, or in the slow, difficult arc of a young officer trying to begin making things right, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story, because every one of them matters and so do you.